All right, so some people have asked me why I seem to have changed my tune on Lord of the Rings of Power and diversity. So, many months ago, probably close to a year ago, I talked about this and made a video about it. Talked about a little bit how token diversity is not the best kind of diversity. I still think that. I still think and agree with people who say we should have more diverse stories. I'd love to see an African RPG. I'd love to see, more stuff like the Korean show Kingdom, so on and so forth. But I have changed my opinion on some of this because I think that even though there is a best way to do diversity, I still think diversity is important. And I think that it's important that we welcome diversity in shows like Rings of Power, especially when that diversity doesn't come weighted down with a bunch of social justice baggage, right? So we don't have a show that is preaching a lot of really overly woke ideas. This is not a show that is making all the men look bad, making all white people look bad, whatever. It's not doing these things people were worried it would do. We have Galadriel being rescued by a man. She has to be saved like a damsel in distress at one point. This is clearly not a show that is making Galadriel just the best of everything. She's, I talked about how she's not a Mary Sue. She's not, because she's not without flaws. She's clearly flawed. Her ambition blinds her. It alienates her. It leads to mutiny. So why change my mind? Well, first of all, I like to keep an open mind. I like to look at the evidence, and then I like to reassess. And some of the things that I've had to reassess are I've talked about it would be good for these fantasy shows to explain why, this is a medieval setting, right? So you didn't just have diversity that looks like the United States, right? We didn't just have that diversity back in those days, whatever. So why are there black hobbits? Shouldn't maybe these black hobbits be from this tribe of hobbits over here? And why is this elf black? Maybe there's a region where the elves are all black. And I think that's not a bad argument, but at the same time, I think that there's another argument to be made, which is we're not going to deal with race in this show. We're not emphasizing race outside of elves, dwarves, hobbits, humans, and so forth. It's a colorblind show. This black elf, this black dwarf, we're not going to acknowledge that they're black. This diversity in casting is solely for diversity in casting. It's not to make a point. We're not going to treat it in any way. There's, that is just left all out of it entirely in this particular story. And I think that also works because in Lord of the Rings, they don't address this. There's really very little about race. There's not like some fantasy novels where race is a very big deal and different colored human beings are either opposed or there's some sort of conflict there. Maybe there's some sort of crusade element or there's an immigration element or whatever. That's just not the case in Tolkien. So, seeing people be very upset about this show and call it woke, and really the only thing that they can grasp onto is the fact that there's diverse casting, really made me question my own earlier takes on this, because frankly, it just doesn't seem like that big of a deal to me. If there was a bunch of agenda-driven politics infecting the show, that would be one thing. But it seems to me that people are looking so hard to find the boogeyman of wokeness in this show that they're either making stuff up, like Galadriel being a Mary Sue, or they're settling completely on the idea of diverse casting and then bending over backwards to explain why it's so bad. But it's not so bad. I cannot get worked up alongside you. There is not, like I just talked about She-Hulk. There is clearly political agenda being pushed down your throats in She-Hulk. It's done in a heavy-handed way that does no good for the show. It makes it a little bit of a joke, unfortunately, because I like a lot of things about She-Hulk, but the political stuff is its weakest link. Here in Rings of Power, there really isn't any political stuff. Not like that. Not outside of the themes, the very Tolkien-esque themes that it portrays, like friendship and courage. So I guess my thoughts and my opinions have shifted simply because Rings of Power isn't some woke agenda-driven show. And because when I really look at it, it seems to me that if all you've got to complain about is the diversity in casting, then there is a racial and bigoted element to that. I mean, this is a fantasy we're talking about. This is not a history. You can say, well, it's based on, Northern European lore, or Tolkien was creating his own Northern European mythos, or whatever. Fine. But again, he included all sorts of things that have nothing to do with Northern Europe, including his own pantheon of gods and dragons and and orcs and on and on and on. He created a lot of stuff. He used myth and legend to create it, but he did create it, and it is a fantasy. And here is an adaptation of that fantasy. And I would like to see, I'd love to see a really, 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 really hardcore, faithful adaptation of Lord of the Rings someday. My idea is a 3-season long animated show, about 8 episodes per book, about 8 hours per book, that follow it about as closely as you can realistically follow it. Which would mean, pretty slow first couple of episodes, as we spend a lot of time in the Shire and then a long time walking through forests. Lots of elven song, prepare yourself for that. I think it'd be really cool. And I'd love that, I'd love just a beautiful animated version of The Lord of the Rings. But I'm also happy that we're getting stuff like Rings of Power, which tells a new story with lots of mystery, and it tells it in the Second Age, which, most of us have not spent that much time in. And even Tolkien, has tons of notes and whatnot, but a lot of it's conflicting, and a lot of it's just kind of his random scattered thoughts on all these stories and histories and characters. So I guess that's where I'm coming from. I think that it's really easy to feel a reactionary sort of feeling of backlash towards the overly woke contingent that has pushed a lot of this stuff into fandoms. And I think we have the tale of two fandoms, right? The old fandom, the new fandom. I think that both can make mistakes. I think the old fandom can be too reactionary, can be too protective of its things. And I think that the new fandom coming in, to D&D and other places where there is this push to sort of censor or chastise, or say that the old ways, the old ways are all bad, and so we need all these new ways that cater to a new fandom. I think that can be also kind of shitty and not fair. So I think that as with all things, there has to be a little adaptation and a little meeting in the middle here. You can't just have it one way or another. The old fandom cannot simply resist all change, because that is not how the world works. And the new fandom can't come in and think that making massive changes to everything will result in those things still being good, because you can take it too far, and you can lose what made it magical in the first place. So I think as there's somewhere in the middle of this culture war, this pop culture war, there has to be a balance that's struck. And to me, a pretty healthy balance in Rings of Power is that there's some more diverse casting here, but there's not a heavy political agenda. I'm cool with that. That's actually not so bad. And it means more people can be involved in this. And let's be real. Like the population of the US, the UK, the Anglosphere in general is very diverse now. And I don't think there's anything wrong with letting that diversity be reflected back into the fictional work that the Anglosphere is producing. That the British and American TV and whatever, producing more diverse shows, reflecting a more diverse and inclusive community is not a bad thing. At the same time, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Now, let's not go in and fill these shows and these games and everything else with a political agenda that just tosses everything out. There has to be a balance struck. And I guess that's where my impulse is always to head, is to find the balance. Is to, people, have accused me in the past of like fence sitting or whatever. But I truly do believe that in the middle of these extremes is where we find the most rational solutions. So as we see, D&D being, in some ways gutted, where there's all these problematic things all the time. I think we have to look at that and we have to say, okay, some of this might be a little problematic. We certainly don't need a reactionary D&D that doubles down on racial differences and stuff. But we also don't need to come in and say that the whole concept of race, like elves, dwarves, and so forth, is deeply problematic, because it's just a fundamental part of the game. So, anyways, D&D video for another time because there's a whole bag of worms there. But I think it as far as settling on a balance, I think Rings of Power has done a good job, and we'll see if it tells a good story because ultimately that's what I want: good stories. That's what I'm concerned with. Is it a good story? Did they hire good actors and directors? Are the special effects? Is the music? Is all of that living up to, you know, this vision of a Tolkien-esque world? Yeah, I think so. So far, I think so. And again, I am also watching this as expensive fan fiction because I know that enough is being changed. But then again, enough was changed in Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings. Those were vastly changed from the books, and people love those. So, although plenty of people were very upset by them at the time. I'm still kind of upset that when I think of Frodo, I think of Elijah Wood. Like, I think he did a fine job, but I don't really want to picture Elijah Wood every time I think of Frodo, and I can't help it now. So, this is the struggle that we face. Anyways, thanks for watching. Peace.